to begin this morning with a tale of two golfers. I was invited to a very exclusive, members-only country club in St. Louis to golf with a member of my church, and he was bringing two of his employees to golf with us. One was like a white-collar, office job type of guy, and the other one was a guy on the ground actually doing and working in construction. Their names were Chris and Danny, respectively. George was the guy who invited me to play, and he said, I want you to play with us because I want these guys to start coming to our church. They're about your age. Maybe you could have a good influence on them. And I'm like, well, if you want me to have influence, the golf course probably isn't the best place. Like, you want to go shoot around, play basketball, I would have a better chance. But golf, I'm Shankopotamus. I'm all over the place. You know, I might even lose my pastor card while I'm out there. I don't know. Not really, but you get my point. He said, no, come on. It'll be great. So we show up, and Chris was already there. Now, Chris, I nicknamed for the day Captain Callaway because he was Callaway everything. And it turns out that he had just went and bought a brand new set of Callaway irons, a brand new Callaway golf bag, a brand new Callaway outfit, brand new Callaway golf clubs, hat, all of it. Like, he basically went into a golf shop and turned to like page 73 and said, make me look like this guy. And he did. So he's out there, he's got this brand new shiny clubs, all this stuff, and he was telling George, he's like, oh yeah, then I got this, and then, this putter's really good, it's an Odyssey, and he's talking about all of his golf clubs, and, he's like, Doug, what do you play? What kind of balls do you play? I'm like, whatever I find in the woods is really, I play a rock if it's round enough, like, I don't really care. Like, 2 parts or 3? I'm like, no, I'm not having this conversation. I have no idea what we're talking about. So, George told the guys putting the bags on the carts, hey, this guy and I want us to be together, and Chris and the other guy, they're going to be together. Well, Chris had them switch my bag and his so he could be with the boss. The boss comes out and he finds out, and he about said, I said, no, it's okay. You go ahead and do that. I'll golf with the new guy, Danny, whenever he gets here. Well, Danny comes walking up, and Danny is wearing, like, he had just come off the job site, basically. So he's got jeans that are really, really dirty. He is putting on his polo over his like blazing orange shirt as he's getting up there, and one of the guys comes out to George, the guy who's a member of this club, and they're like, hey, he's not allowed to wear jeans on the golf course, but we'll make an exception because he's with you. And Danny was really embarrassed. He's like, boss, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to go home and change. Like, I barely got here in time. I luckily had a polo in my truck. And George was like, dude, don't worry about it. I pay enough money to be a member here. You could golf in your underwear. They'd be fine with it. I'm like, how much does it cost to be a member here, if that's really the case? So in the midst of the switching, Chris forgot to tighten his clubs in. So like we take off to the first tee. His brand new Callaway clubs come flying off the cart onto the roadway, which I thought was funny. And you know how there's sometimes things that are funny, but you're trying not to laugh at them, which makes you laugh harder? That was the situation that we found ourselves in. I think Danny thought I was out of my mind. He's like, are you like 5 years old? What's going on? But he doesn't know that Chris tried to switch the clubs real quick and tried to like be all sly and do all this stuff. Then we get to the first tee box, and Danny is the first guy to hit. So Danny walks up, and George's like, hey, 2 off the first tee if you need him. Oh, thank you, sir, okay. Puts his ball, hits it. Like 300 and something yards straight down the middle of the fairway. One of the best shots I've ever seen hit. And I'm watching this ball flight, and he doesn't. He hits, picks up his tee, and starts walking back to the cart. Now, I have to watch every shot that I shoot. 1, because if I'm in the woods, I got to mark the tree that I went in. Maybe I can find it, okay? 2, if it is a good shot and I happen to be in the fairway, I like to watch that thing. And I will pose. I will hit, and I will just sit there and pose and look that thing up and down. Maybe flip the club. Did you guys see that? Right down the middle. Right where I was aiming. So either way, I'm watching that golf shot. Danny didn't. Chris gets up and like shanks it worse than I've ever seen a ball shanked in my life. And I thought, okay, here's what we've got. We've got a golfer who doesn't look like a golfer, who's really a golfer. And we got a golfer who paid tons of money to look like a golfer who clearly doesn't golf. But that didn't stop Chris from talking about all the exclusive courses and clubs in different places that he's gotten to play in St. Louis, and trying to make sure that Danny and I knew, and George as well, like what clubs he had played at. And all Danny would say is, oh yeah, that's a nice course. That's a really nice course. Well, Danny gets to his approach shot, which is right in the middle of the fairway, and he hits it past the pin, hits the green, and rolls back. He puts spin on it. And I thought, okay, we've got a golfer. here. And once again, he just hits it as a real casual thing, walks back, goes back. I'm like, okay. We get to the cart, and I said, hey, you've been playing some golf. You're a golfer. He said, yeah, I played in college a little bit. I'm like, really? Well, what college do you play at? Mizzou. I'm like, oh, University of Missouri. So you're a Division I golfer. At the time, I know they're SEC now, but at the time, they were the Big 12 Conference. So you played golf in the Big 12 Conference. Kind of a big deal. Well, I knew that George was a big donor. He was a big booster to Mizzou. He bought a house in Columbia just to go to football games every Saturday that they had a home game. He went to tons of, I knew he was a big Mizzou guy. And I'm like, I wonder if George knows that Danny played at Mizzou. So at one point, third hole in, Danny has not hit a bad shot yet. And George is like, Danny, have you had lessons? Like, my goodness, you're a good golfer. I was like, George, you probably don't know. He played at Mizzou. And George's eyes lit up. You're kidding me. You played at Mizzou. You know Coach so-and-so? Yeah. He was my coach. He helped me with my swing back when I played. He's like, he was my best friend in college. We were fraternity brothers. This is amazing. So they're talking for a little bit. He goes back to the cart because we're going to the next hole. He comes flying out of his cart once we get there with his phone. Hey, I just texted Coach so-and-so. He wanted me to make sure to tell you hi. Well, from that point on, it was George and Danny. And Chris was trying to get his way into conversations, and he was trying to make sure that people knew how much the golf clubs that he were playing with cost and, all this stuff. But it was like they were competing with each other, but Danny was clearly winning, and Danny wasn't even trying to win. And I'm in the back of it all going, hey, I've only lost 2 balls today. I'm having a pretty good round. I'm pretty happy, And I found 3 when I was looking for some other ones. I'm on top of things. How'd you play, Doug? I played great. I was 1 over. Par? No, I found 1 more ball than I lost. That's how I define my golf rounds. Then at the very end of the round, George is like, hey, Danny, I tell you what, I want you to put your clubs on my cart. Let's go play 9 more. I want to play 9 more. I got some stuff I want to talk to you about. And Chris is like, oh, you guys will play 9 more? I'm in for 9 more. And George is like, no, Danny and I are going to play. Doug, I'll see you later. And Chris, I'll see you guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Which I was like, good. I'm tired and I'm 1 over on golf balls. I don't want to ruin that luck. It's like, going to the casino. Quit while you're ahead. Same thing for me on the golf course. Don't go to the casino, by the way. That was a trick statement. Well, Chris was just beside himself, and he was angry, and he puts his clubs in the trunk and puts his shoe, and he gets off, and he speeds away. And I could tell at that moment that he was beyond frustrated because the thing he wanted to do was to get as much face time with the boss as he could and impress the boss, and he did everything within his power to do so, including buying probably like $1,500 worth of gear when you talk about the bag, the clubs, the outfit, all of it. And Danny, who was wearing jeans, breaking club rules, came walking up, and it was like, he was about as unassuming and quiet and humble as you could be, but he's the guy who got FaceTime with the boss. And it kind of goes along with what we're talking about today as we continue our series, Paradox. Now, we're talking about different statements that Jesus makes that seem contradictory on the surface, like the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And it's like, now, how can both of those statements be true? But when you start to look at it, it ends up being true on a spiritual level. Well, the paradoxical statement that we're going to unpack today is true both on a spiritual level, but also on a practical level as well. In fact, in the context that Jesus gives this paradoxical statement, the context of it is within like, hey, let me just give you guys some practical advice. And it does have application on a spiritual level, but its initial application is just live your life this way. It'll end up being better for you. Now, if you've got a Bible, I want to encourage you to turn it to Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 11. Context of our passage is Jesus has been invited to the home of a prominent Pharisee. So we know the Pharisees, these super religious, elitist types of guys. Well, this guy was a super elitist among the elitists. And he invited Jesus to have dinner after a Sabbath service at his home. The thing about it is, they did meals and invited guests in like a completely different way. Like you and I don't think the way that they think. They thought, remember, we've talked about this a little bit last week, they were big on shame and honor. And so how you address people when they come into the room, and we used to be like this, I think, as a culture, like when a woman comes to the table, everybody stands. Like that used to be something we would do. We don't do that as much anymore. We're becoming less focused on shame and honor and chivalry and things like that. I'm not saying that's good. That's where we're at as a culture. We focus more on justice and being right and wrong. Well, in their culture, when you were invited to dinner, where you sat meant something. And so whenever Jesus is invited to this dinner, he ends up healing a guy. They tried to trap him on, is he going to heal on the Sabbath or not? But then as he looks around the room, he notices how these Pharisees, these super religious leaders, are kind of competing with each other to see who's going to sit closest to the host. In fact, verse 7 says, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them a parable. Now remember, at these tables, they would sit at a U shape. Almost exclusively, that's how they would sit. It was a big U, with the host being at like the bottom of the U. The person to his to his left was the person of honor. The person to his right was in the second prime position, and then it just staggered all the way down to the very end. Now, if you come to my house for a Labor Day barbecue, I'm just going to have lawn chairs sitting out and just sit where you want. You can sit on the deck, you can sit on the ground, do whatever you want. We don't think that way. We don't think, well, how close do I get to sit to Doug? In fact, with COVID restrictions, probably not that close, right? You want to sit at least 6 feet apart, even if we're outdoors. But I digress. So we don't think in that way. In fact, in this type of setting, nobody ever thinks, I want to sit up front, because that means I'm a more important church member. It's the opposite. People like to sit in the back so that when you fall asleep, I don't notice as much. But I always do, just FYI. But we don't think in terms of where we sit isn't important. But in their culture, it was very important. So Jesus sees these guys rushing to these different spots, kind of like, kids do after a timeout. Like they get to the bench as quick as they can so they can get as close to coach as possible. This is what Jesus sees these adult, prominent Pharisees doing. So he notices it and he says, I'm going to tell you guys a story. Okay? Here's what he says in verse 8. He says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. So even if you get there first and the prime position is open, do not take it, because something may end up happening. When that more important person comes, they may be late, the host who invited both of you might say, hey, this person's more important than you are, give this person your seat. And then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. And it'll be done in front of everybody. And it's not that the host is trying to shame you, but he needs to get you out of the way so that the person who's supposed to sit where you sat gets their seat. So Jesus says if you do that, you think, hey, I'm important and I'm a big shot. Look where I get to sit. Jesus is like, if you do that and you overreach, the person who that seat was intended for may show up, and then you actually get to the last spot. So instead of getting all this clout and all this attention by sitting in the seat of honor, you end up being humiliated. It says, and on the flip side, Jesus says, when you're invited, take the lowest place. Even if you're the first to arrive, and even if people are trying to fight over where they're going to sit, just take the lowest place. So that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, what are you doing down there? Move up to a better place. So there will be movement in both situations. One will humiliate you, and one will bring you honor. He goes on to say in the second half of verse 10, then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. And then, here's our paradoxical statement. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. If you want to advance your cause or your career or whatever, you've got to be careful, because the more you try to exalt yourself and put a spotlight on you and make you look important, the more that you do that, there's usually only one way to go, and that's down. On the flip side, if you try to be really humble in the way that you live your life and you just try to honor God and serve and do what you're supposed to do, that type of person usually gets exalted even though they're trying to live a humble way. Now, once again, this is just really practical advice that Jesus is giving that also has spiritual implications as well. Because he's literally saying, hey, when you go to a banquet, don't do this. Don't do what you're doing right now. Do the opposite, and it will end up better for you. Just think of the two guys I played golf with. Think of Chris and Danny. Chris was going to make sure that the boss was impressed with his really nice new golf clubs and really impressed with his golf outfit. In fact, he even moved his club so that he could be with the boss. Forgot to cinch him in, but he was there. He was going to be there with the boss the whole time. And when they were in the cart driving to the next hole, he was probably telling all kinds of stories to the boss and probably even said things like, yeah, my swing's been really messing up. I'm trying to do something different. You have to go backwards before you go forwards with your swing. And so I'm just kind of off today. Probably saying all kinds of stuff. And then in the other cart, you got Danny. He just doesn't really care. He's just there to play golf. And he played some really, really good golf. Danny was humble through the whole thing, didn't really say a lot. Chris initially was talking about all the exclusive places that he played until George found out that Danny played Division I golf and said, hey, Danny, what's the nicest course you've ever played on? And the conversation all got turned to Danny. And it was, hey, Danny, what about it? Hey, Danny, what would you do on this shot? And hey, Danny, I'm on my backswing. What am I supposed to do? It was like, Danny, Danny, Danny. And Chris the whole time is pulling his hair out, wanting to be noticed. And he was doing his best to exalt himself, and he ended up getting humbled. Danny was just humbled through the whole thing, and he ends up getting exalted. And Doug's in the back eating popcorn, watching this whole thing unfold, thinking it's funny. It's the tale of three golfers. And so when you think about this on a practical level first, let's think practically, and then we'll go spiritually. On a practical level, just understand what is in each and every one of us, which is a desire to push ourselves to the forefront and to put ourselves in the spotlight. We naturally like having attention. And there are moments and seasons in our lives where we do a really bad job trying to gain attention. And here's the thing about it, is that you notice when other people do it. It's very clear, it's very obvious, and it's disgusting when you see it. When a person starts to fish for compliments, or when a person inserts themselves in a conversation that has nothing to do with them, but all of a sudden they make it about them. Or maybe you are talking about something, let's just say golf, and Danny and George are talking about golf, and Chris comes in and gives his 2 cents when he clearly, he's talking about being a member on all these exclusive courses. I don't think they'd let him on Indian Hills. That's how bad he was, okay? And it'd be clear, he's just trying to me, and we can see it in other people. It's like, dude, this is pathetic. Just let it go. But when other people, it's obvious. But when we do it, we never really notice it. And the problem is, we need to realize how naturally we do it. And there are different situations that might bring this out of us, this desire to exalt ourselves. And in moments where you may feel a little insecure, let's say, or let's say you just meet a new boss, or you're around a new group of people, you want to establish how smart you are, how well read, how good you are, how good your diet. We want to be known for something. And we'll just let things be thrown out there. It's like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. Like this morning when I was doing 1,000 push-ups at 5:30 a.m. because I'm real disciplined and I was meditating. Like we do things like that. If you do 1,000 push-ups, by the way, bravo. Good stuff. But whenever we think about in those new settings, we will try to find ways to throw ourselves to the forefront and put a spotlight on ourselves. And what we don't realize is to other people, they look at it and they go, you just seem really desperate and really insecure. And they may play the game along with you. Oh, 1,000 push-ups. Good for you. Wow, you're really strong. But they don't mean it. Deep down they're thinking, boy, this person is pathetic. And you are trying to exalt yourself. What you don't realize is you're being humbled in the minds of the people that you're trying to exalt yourself in front of. So be mindful of that. And watch that. And if you are good at something, don't be the one to talk about it. Let other people talk about it. In my story, Danny did not tell George he played at Mizzou. I told George Danny played at Mizzou. And Danny told me because I was trying to learn about him and ask him a bunch of questions. And he was really in a humble position, and he was humbling himself, and as a result, he's the one who gets exalted because he wasn't trying to make everything about him, and then everything slowly became about him. So on a practical level, be mindful of how often you talk about yourself and how often you try to make people notice you. Be mindful of that. And you don't always notice when you do it. Everybody else does. So try to make your conversations about other people. Try to notice them. Don't always put a spotlight on you. On a spiritual level, let's be reminded that while we are here on earth, our primary goal and our primary objective is to put a big spotlight on God, to bring people into a relationship with Him. Now, this is illustrated a couple of ways whenever I look at the Gospels. One example is John the Baptist, John chapter 3, after he baptizes Jesus, and Jesus then goes and starts preaching and teaching to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. He basically takes John's message and he even amplifies it with all the miraculous signs. And John's disciples notice that all these people who used to come hear John preaching by the Jordan River are now going to follow Jesus. And their response to that is, John, look what's happening. Everybody's following Jesus now. It's almost like, John, you've lost your opportunity. You've lost your name. Like, people no longer care about John the Baptist. They only care about Jesus. Like, what are we going to do to get people to once again start coming and listening to us preach? And John's like, this is exactly what's supposed to happen. This isn't about how popular I am or how many people I have coming and listening to me preach. Like, I'm supposed to pass the baton to Jesus. And then he says this great line in John 3:30. Depending on your translation, he says, I must become less, he must become more, or I must become less, and he must become greater. But basically, like, hey, this isn't about me, it's about him. And the attention's supposed to slowly go away from me, and it's supposed to get on to him. That's why I came, was to point people to him. And that should be our lives as well. That our goal is just to point people to Jesus. Jesus then says this in another way in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about what we do with lamps or lights. And in their culture, they don't have electricity. They light a lamp or they light a candle and they put it in the middle of the room so you can kind of see what's going on. He says nobody would ever light a candle and then put it under a bowl, because there'd be no point in lighting the candle in the first place. When you light a candle, you put it in the most prominent place so that it can shed light throughout the entire room. In the same way, Jesus says, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise you. Not what he says. That they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Let your light shine before men, Jesus says, that they may see the good deeds that you do and then praise your Father in heaven. So whenever I say we need to humble ourselves, that is not that when we do things that we never let anybody know about it, we always try to do things in secret. We're just supposed to live our lives the way that God has called us to. We're called to do the things that Jesus has called us to do. And when people see our good deeds, that's a chance for us to point them to the goodness of the Father. And I will say this as well, that the goal is not to be exalted in this life, the goal is to be exalted in the next. So on a spiritual level, when you look at John the Baptist, for instance, John the Baptist is eventually beheaded because he preaches what he's supposed to preach, he makes people in power mad, and they behead him for it. But when he gets to heaven, and he gets to live eternity in God's presence, he's not just going to be some no-named person, and like people are going to know John the Baptist, they're going to know his story, and he's going to have a big old mansion in heaven. He will be exalted not here, but there. And there have been a lot of guys that I know, and I look at like coaches, I look at teachers, I look at pastors, that you may not know who they are, you may not know their story, but they've had a very deep and profound impact on the lives of the people that they coached or taught or ministered to. And their goal is not to have their name in lights, and their goal is not to get a book deal, or their goal is not to be on TV. They just want to live their life, do what they're supposed to do. And whenever you do that, your exaltation, it may come in this life, but it will certainly come in the next. And as I think about the way that we live, and you look at it on a spiritual level, that we give credit to God, and we point people to God, and we try to lead people to God, like that's everything we're about, that's our mission, that's why we're here. But there's always a fine line between leading people to God and leading people to ourselves, or putting a spotlight on God and putting a spotlight on us. And we've got to be mindful of that, and we've got to be careful of it. Like, for instance, and I think about, how does this sermon apply? And I always apply it to myself first, and then I think, well, how does it apply to you all second? Because I got to make sure I'm not in violation of this before I tell you how not to be in violation of this. So I started thinking of different pastors, well-known pastors on the national level, even pastors that, and when I say local, they're not necessarily like, in Southern Illinois, but maybe closer that you would know who they are. And I think of the way that they'll maybe cross the line over from exalting God to exalting themselves. So that, like, when you go to, like, instead of going to woodlawnchristian.org, you would go to dougjunkins.org or dougjunkins.com. I think that's a problem. Because who is that about then? It's not about we, it's about me. And I'm not against the pastor getting a book deal and blessing people with the words that God gave him, as long as we acknowledge that those all come from God, and that as Christians we are gifted to do what God wants us to do. But, like, what happens when you no longer start having Woodlawn Christian t-shirts and logos and, like, my face starts going on stuff? Who is it about then? Like, I don't want to put my face on anything unless I'm trying to scare mice out of my barn or something. Then, Didn't land either services, actually. That joke didn't. No, didn't land. And so whenever you think about, okay, my goal is not to do a bad job. My goal is to do the best job I can as a pastor. But in doing a good job, I can either point people to God or I can point people to myself. And here's my worry, is when God says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. If I keep making this about me, or I try to make it about me, and I'm putting my name and stuff, and it's my brain, and it's me, I got to recognize that if I'm good at anything, it's because God gifted me in that area. And if God gave me a gift, He can take it away. In fact, God may love me enough to want to save me from myself, to keep me from going down a path, potentially. This is hypothetical. But what if God said, you know what? This is no longer about me and no longer about my mission, no longer about glory and honor to my name. This is becoming about you. I'm going to take that gift away so you can't keep going further down this path of self-destruction. I think this has happened to pastors in America, like they're on top, and we could, like, you just do a Google search, because people love to pile it on when a pastor goes from, like, kind of popular mountaintop down to the bottom, because I think the world likes to see Christians fail. And so you could do a Google search and you could find all types of guys. I don't want to mention them by name because I don't feel good about taking somebody's name through the mud. But there are guys I can think of specifically that are nationally known that just poof, did like a nosedive into the ground. They were on top of the mountain. They had thousands upon thousands of people in their church. They had book deals. They had small group curriculum. And now they've been fired, or they had a moral failure, or something happened. And I think, and I don't know if this is all, like, I'm not trying to overreach what the text is trying to tell us, but they tried to exalt themselves, and guess what? They got humbled. Now you're sitting there thinking, okay, that's good for you. So Doug, if we ever see you come out with dougjunkins.com instead of woodlawnchristian.org, we know, hey, we got to watch out for this guy. And we'll have a conversation with you. But what does that mean for me? Well, here's what I'll say, is that you all have talents, you all have abilities, you all have gifts that you've been given. Everything you are given, leverage them to put a spotlight on God. And when you find yourself starting to need attention from your peers and need the accolades and need the attaboys, and that becomes a part of kind of who you are and it begins to shape your identity, instead of just being a child of God and you're humbly serving, you need people to say all these things about you. What will happen is you'll start doing these things so that people will say things about you, and you'll start to exalt yourself. And Jesus says, you're trying to go up, but there's only one way you can go when you're trying to go up, and that's down. On the flip side, if you just are humble and you love people and you try to serve God and do what you're supposed to do, and it's not about you, it's about Him, you try to humble yourself, you'll find yourself in a place of exaltation. And you won't even care. John the Baptist was exalted for much of his earthly ministry, didn't really care. And that's why when people were leaving and they were following Jesus, he's like, that's the way, no, I don't care. I'm supposed to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to keep preaching. I'm going to keep baptizing here in the Jordan River. More people are supposed to follow him because I'm supposed to become less. He's supposed to become more, and it's all good. And when we get to that place, that's when the words of Jesus, of this paradoxical statement, will come to their fullest. That those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So I challenge you this week to think about moments, conversations, and situations where you find yourself exalting yourself. You got to nip those. You got to fight against that egotistical behavior that's in each and every one of us. Fight against it, because it's not going to bring God glory. It's going to bring yourself glory. And it is the opposite of how we're supposed to live as Jesus followers. So be thinking about that over the course of these next few days and even the next few weeks. And as we kind of wrap up our teaching time today, we want to be mindful of why this is all possible and why we gather and why we sing and why we study God's words, because of the sacrifice of Jesus. And so if you've got your prepackaged communion cup, I'm going to encourage you to get it out and go ahead and peel back that first layer, exposing the bread. And as we partake of the bread, we want to remember Christ's broken body, the beating he took, that he was slapped around, that he was spat on, and at any moment he could have stopped it, but he didn't, because he wanted us to be forgiven of our sins, and he wanted us to have a relationship with him. So as we take and eat, let's remember Christ's broken body. In the same way, we take the cup and we remember Christ's shed blood poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.